Well, No Child Left Behind took an already bad federal situation where the federal government was spending tens of billions of dollars on education every year to where they said, okay, you're spending this money and it doesn't seem to be working, so we're going to now have the federal government tell you you must have standards in tests in math and reading and science, and every year you have to get closer and closer to something called proficiency by 2014, which might sound great, except this led to huge federal micromanaging of the schools. At the same time, it said to every state, you define proficiency. Of course, they all set it at very low levels, so they stayed out of trouble. So it massively increased federal power, but again, did nothing to improve academic outcomes. In fact, what it essentially did was told states lie to parents by saying their kids were proficient when in no reasonable way were they close to that.
When Thomas Jefferson said we should educate the whole mass of people, did he necessarily mean that the federal government or any government should do it?
Well, he definitely didn't mean the federal government. In fact, when he was president, he wrote on this and said there were some things he'd like the federal government to do in education, but that the Constitution would have to be amended. And of course, it was never amended to include education. And when he talked about setting up a system for Virginia, his home state, it was only going to be for the first really 3 years of schooling. And then after that, only a very select few kids would go up all the way to college. So he did talk a little bit about education, but he was quite clear the federal government should stay out. And he also said that for the most part, it was much better to keep education in the private sector.
Neil McCluskey, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's not even February yet, and already more than 700 waivers to Obamacare have been granted to friends of the president. If this law is so great, why are so many companies being allowed to ignore it? My freedom fighters are here to tackle that one next. Well, we're not yet a month into 2011, and already the Obama administration has granted more than 700 health care waivers in January alone. If the president is repealing Obamacare for his friends, why doesn't he repeal it for everyone? Here to discuss, my Fox Business Network reporter, colleague Dennis Neal, Reason Magazine editor, and Freedom Watch regular Catherine Mangu Ward, and Mike Norman, chief economist at John Thomas Financial. Does it upset you that a law so contentious, so difficultly wrought, so oppressive, has been given so many exemptions, and the exemptions seem to be given for political reasons?
So, okay, let's figure this out. 733 exemptions out of 200 million people in the population insured private insurance. I mean, are you saying that's a lot? Look, I looked at the list. I mean, and you said it was Obama's friends. I mean, it covers all different kinds of businesses and entities. I don't think that's a lot. I mean, what it does suggest, in my opinion, that, you know, this is still an unformed law. This is not the final platform that we're going to have. I think it's going to evolve from here. There's going to be tweaks. And eventually, my opinion is we'll go to a single-payer system.
All right.
Meaning we'll go to a government payer system,
well,
which
would
would
be
be bad.
with that? Single payer, you know it'll be good.
Right. But in terms of whether it's a big number or not, which Michael just pointed out, I just want to say that, wait, that's just those who've asked so far. I'll bet you a lot of companies out there have no idea they can even ask. And when you look at the people, I read through that list today, 2.1 million people covered by the waivers requested. Do you know unions represent only 7% of the private sector, guys? Union workers have easily 500,000, 25% of the people covering these waivers.
Catherine,
sounds like favors done to me.
Isn't this the problem with government trying to micromanage an industry? It writes the rules, and then it has the power to write the exemptions to those rules. Question, how does it decide who to enforce the rules against and who to exempt from them?
The fact that there are so many exemptions going on here is just, it highlights a very fundamental point, which is that right now the administration is asking too much of American companies. They are being told that they have to pull a rabbit out of a hat and give everybody these new benefits, better coverage, keep their kids on their plans until they're 26 years old, that kind of thing. And it's just not something a lot of American companies
Which
can
is
do.
exactly,
And I think it's quite.
listen, can I make a comment on this?
No, let me ask you this. Is this a consequence of trying to accomplish too much in 2,700 pages at one time rather than doing this incrementally?
Perhaps it's a consequence of having put a huge new law, and you could say entitlement, out the door, which, as I said before, needs to evolve. But let me get back to these waivers, okay? Because they have to follow a strict criteria. And what it is that if the current insurance, and it has a lot to do with the unions who have insurance that maybe in the changeover is going to leave them undercovered or else causes the premium to go to such a level that they can't afford it, that's where the waiver is granted. Don't forget, the law is intended to provide insurance for 30 million people who otherwise weren't covered.
And in the process, regulate the insurance for the other 300 million people who already have it. At some point, they grant so many exemptions that the exemption becomes the law, and the law is the exemption.
And more than that, these exemptions are from just one part of Obamacare, right? Right now in 2011, it is legal. It's allowed for an insurer to say, you know what, in your lifetime, you've taken $750,000 out. We can't afford it. By 2014, the insurer can't even do that.
Hey, let me.
So we got to change. We got to switch gears. We got to switch gears.
Switch them.
We could talk about this all day. Changing topics, because Harry Reid said this the other day. He blasted the president's pledge to ban earmarks, saying, quote, this is the leader of the Democrats in the Senate. I have a constitutional obligation to do congressionally directed spending. I know much more of what needs to be done in Elko, Nevada, Hawthorne, Nevada, Las Vegas, Nevada, than some bureaucrat does back here, referring to Washington. Short term, he may win this battle, but it's going to be in the short term, referring to the president.
He was just referring to the president, not Washington as a bureaucrat.
I mean, that was the leader of the Democrats referring to the president.
I think he is out of control, and it shows an utter lack of respect, but it shows also on earmarks, this guy is tone deaf. He has no idea that America just said, we don't like this spending all over the place, and at the least you should give us the symbol.
You know something? That's a fallacy, because dealing with earmarks or taking away earmarks, yes, because the biggest items in the budget are Social Security, Medicare, Defense, Medicaid.
But does it seem
not going to do it? And by the way, Ronald Reagan back in 1984 asked for a line item veto, and Congress did the same thing.
Mike, time out. This is not just a Republican or Democratic thing. They both do it. If you go to West Virginia, half the state is named after Robert Byrd. Isn't that unseemly that these guys can take this money and give it to their friends and have it named after them, and there's no vote on it?
Judge, welcome to politics,
away is
okay?
just making Harry Reid's job a lot harder
but again,
anyway.
if you think that dealing with earmarks or retracting them is going to make any impact on the deficit, it's
Catherine.
But you got to start with symbols.
Does anybody worry about the Constitution because it doesn't authorize building bridges and naming them after Robert Byrd?
You know, I do think it's pretty laughable that Harry Reid is suddenly worried about the constitutional propriety of our budgeting process. The fact is, we're just making his job harder if we take away earmarks. It's true they're not a huge part of the budget. It's not entitlements. It's not defense spending. But mostly it's just Harry Reid complaining that his job just got tough because he doesn't have giveaways.
It's sort of an internecine warfare within the Democrats, one that you wouldn't expect.
You know, only 2 years ago, it was the Democrats and Republicans at each other's throats, and we were upset at the lack of bipartisanship. Now I think we ought to be upset at the lack of partisanship within the Democratic Party.
I disagree, because I think that Obama has followed a policy that was really not what progressives and Democrats had sought. I think his appointments in his staff and cabinet members have been shocking to a lot of Democrats.
So I don't hang on. We have 30 seconds. We just have 30 seconds. Catherine, are the Republicans going to stick with an earmark ban, or will they jump on Harry Reid's bandwagon?
I'm sure they'll jump on Harry Reid's bandwagon. We've already heard from, I think, Michelle Bachmann looking to redefine what an earmark is to exclude bridges and tunnels. We are bipartisan in our love of earmarks in this Congress.
If Michelle Bachmann's in favor of earmarks, I guess they're going to stay. Mike Norman, Catherine Mango Ward, Dennis Neal, it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Up next, the plain truth about why America cannot exist without respect for the rights of the states. Does the government work for us, or do we exist to work for the government? Does the Constitution really mean what it says, or can the federal government write any law it wants? Tonight, the Constitution and your right to vote with your feet. You wouldn't know it from listening to the president on Tuesday night or to any of his recent predecessors for that matter, but the federal government was designed by the framers to be a government of limited powers. And the federal government was limited so as to diffuse governmental power between the feds and the states and then among the states themselves. This diffusion of power, where the federal government addresses only matters that the states gave to it in the Constitution, and where the states retain for themselves all governmental powers not given to the feds, was intended to keep governmental power from becoming concentrated in one place or in one person. The diffusion of power among the feds and the states also guarantees choices for everyone to make as they see fit. Thus, as President Reagan was fond of saying, you can vote with your feet. So long as the states retain their powers, and so long as the states exercise those powers differently, we will all have freedom of choice. So, for example, if you don't like the Soviet style of all-pervasive government in Massachusetts, you can move to New Hampshire, where the motto is live free or die. If you don't want to pay the highest in the union real estate and income taxes in New Jersey, you can move to Pennsylvania, where some of New Jersey's taxes haven't even been heard of. The point here is not an academic one. The point here is that in order to preserve freedom and freedom of choices, the framers deliberately left the business of everyday governing to the states and created a federal government to address only those limited matters directly delegated to it in the Constitution. Of course, we all know what happened, starting with Lincoln's unconstitutional income tax and moving to Wilson's telling us how to live and what to eat, and proceeding to FDR's seizure of gold and establishment of regulatory agencies immune from public pressure or congressional will. The feds took power away from the states and regulated people's lives directly. Some of those regulations, though clearly unconstitutional, seemed reasonable, like clean water and clean air. Other regulations looked like the states enacted them, like national speed limits, but really they were bought and paid for by the feds. So many people just accepted these regulations, went on with their lives, and looked the other way. Then along came Obamacare, with its compelled health insurance and its orders to the states to raise their taxes and its micromanaging of the healthcare industry. It's not only unconstitutional, it's unreasonable, it's authoritarian, it robs freedom of choice, and most folks and most states have now had enough. For the first time in modern history, the governments of more than half the states, 27 at last count, have sued the feds to invalidate this terrible law. And now 6 of those states are really forcing the issue with the concept of nullification. Nullification occurs when a state enacts a state law that makes it a crime to follow a federal law within that state. And this can be done so long as the federal law being nullified does not fall under the powers delegated by the states to the Congress. And that's just what health care is. What governments regulate the practice of medicine? The states. What governments regulate the insurance industry? The states. What governments regulate nurses, doctors, hospitals, and pharmacies? The states. So when the feds come in after 230 years and simply declare that they are now the king of this hill, the states have every right to nullify. This will be a long process, but if the courts follow the Constitution, we will all have the freedom of choice that is the founders' gift to us and our birthright. From New York, defending freedom every night of the week. So long, America.